Final speaker for the first session this morning is Fergus Whelan. Fergus is an author and historian. He's come up from Dublin. His biography of William Drennan was published in 2020 to great acclaim, and he was also very involved in the practical business of education in helping to set up the Dublin 7 education initiative, and his children were educated through there, so an example to us all. Fergus's talk today, I think, wins title of the day so far. It's called Education and the Slavish Mindset. Fergus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The invitation for me to speak here today arises from an address I delivered to Reclaim the Enlightenment Bastille Day celebration about the British and Irish Enlightenment. However, it's a daunting task for me to speak about education. I'm not an educational professional. My happiest personal experience in education was when I escaped it, when I left O'Connell School at the age of 16 to pursue a trade, to pursue an apprenticeship in the bricklaying trade. Until about 20 years ago, in the south of Ireland, unlike Northern Ireland, there was little or no access for the sons and daughters of blue-collar workers to third education. In fact, had I been born 2 years earlier than I was, I would not have received the little second-level education that I actually managed to get, because second-level fees were abolished only in the south of Ireland in 1968. When I finally got to attend university at the ripe old age of 35, I had to attend a British college, because no Southern Irish college would have admitted me because of my lack of a leaving cert. I suppose the good news is, though, in the south of Ireland, although inequality carries on, certainly there's a lot more access for working class kids to third level education in the south than there was 20 years ago. For the philosophers of the British and Irish Enlightenment, education was a vital aspect of social improvement and a pathway to human freedom. John Locke, Robert Molesworth, Francis Hutchinson, Belfast's own William Drennan all had strong views on education which are worth referring to today. The great female educator of the late Enlightenment was, of course, Mary Wollstonecraft, who denounced the denial of proper education available even to privileged aristocratic females. She advocated an education that would encourage girls and women to think. Her husband, William Godwin, specialised in children's literature in the hope of stimulating their imagination and creativity. He pioneered books and stories written for children so that they could develop their interests and knowledge of the world through reading. First of all, John Locke, 1632 to 1707. Before discussing John Locke's ideas in education, a short synopsis of where he sits in the history of early modern Britain may be useful. He rejected the idea, orthodox in his time, that monarchs held their throne through divine right. The orthodox maintained that the crowned heads of Europe were God's anointed, who should be obeyed regardless of how tyrannical they proved to be. Locke had left England for Holland in the reign of Charles II, as he was aligned with some of those who were involved with the recently found Whig party. The Whigs had attempted to exclude James, Duke of York, from ascending the throne on the count of his avowed Roman Catholicism. When the exclusionists failed, some of Locke's associates were connected with the Rye House Plot 1683, which was an attempt to assassinate King Charles II and his brother, the Duke of York. Locke felt safe in returning to England only after William of Orange succeeded James II. Locke believed that children are born with a mind with a blank piece of paper, a clean slate, a tabula rasa. He also maintained that children are potentially free and rational beings, and that the realisation of these human qualities tends to be disillusioned through the imposition of prejudice that perpetuates oppression and fallacy. Locke believed it was the upbringing and the education of children that hindered their developing their humanity. He published some thoughts concerning education in 1693. This treatise is on the education of gentlemen, was the most important philosophical work on education in England for over a century. That's a quote from somebody, that's not me saying that. For Locke, the purpose of education was to produce in the individual a sound mind and body so as to better serve his country. Now, note the word his. As far as Locke was very much a man of his time, and as far as females were concerned, they might as well not have existed when it came to his thoughts on education. Another invalid aspect of Locke's thought was that the content of education should depend on one's station in life. The common man only required moral, social and vocational knowledge. He could do quite well with the Bible and a highly developed vocational skill that would serve to support him in life and offer social services to others. However, the education of gentlemen ought to be of the very highest quality. The gentleman must serve his country in positions of leadership. A more progressive aspect of his outlook was that he held that the content and curriculum must serve some practical ends. He recommended the introduction of contemporary foreign languages, history, geography, economics, maths and science. Most of the philosophers and thinkers of the Enlightenment concurred with Locke that the classical education known as scholasticism, which stressed Greek and Latin, rhetoric and the art of public speaking and debate, were not fit for purpose even in the early modern world. It has been suggested at the end of the 18th century, when William Blake asked, "Was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills?" He was not referring to the sweatshops of the Industrial Revolution. But to Oxford and Cambridge, where the fellows were required to take holy orders and be ordained Anglican priests. To matriculate, students were required to accept Anglican theology. Oxford and Cambridge and Trinity College Dublin were closed to Irish Presbyterians. Students for the Presbyterian ministry were obliged to attend Glasgow or Edinburgh. It was in the dissenting academies in England, such as Warrington, founded by the Unitarian Dr. Joseph Priestley, and Hackney College, founded by his friend Dr. Richard Price, which followed the progressive Lockean curriculum and encouraged students to practice free inquiry rather than acceptance of religious dogma. It should be noted that Priestley was offered an honorary membership of the Society of United Irishmen, and he was a friend and advisor to Archibald Hamilton Rowan, a founder member of the United Irish Society, who had actually attended Priestley's school at Warrington. Richard Price had advised the Volunteers of Ireland on the Catholic question, and he was a friend and mentor to Mary Wollstonecraft. I want to talk about Robert Molesworth, born in Dublin in 1656, died in 1725. Molesworth was born in Fishamble Street in Dublin. His father had died 4 days before him. Some sources say his father made his fortune supplying Oliver Cromwell's army, others that he fought on the royalist side in the Civil War. Whatever about that, the younger Molesworth was educated in Trinity College Dublin. He sided with William of Orange against James II, and his land was seized, attainted for treason, that is, by James Dublin's Parliament. William appointed him as his envoy to Denmark. In 1694, Molesworth published an account of Denmark as it was in the year 1692. Professor Caroline Robbins of Harvard claims that with the appearance of this pamphlet, Molesworth began an agitation for reform which went further than that offered by the Bill of Rights and the Toleration Act. Robbins identifies an account of Denmark as an important stimulant to the new educational ideas of the period. English Protestants tended to see their homeland as a beacon of liberty and believed that tyranny, persecution and absolutism of France, Spain and Austria and other kingdoms arose from a slavish devotion to popery, which was supposed to be a feature of those society. Molesworth observed that Denmark was a Protestant country, yet it had recently lost its liberty and had fallen into tyranny. He had a very definite view as to why that had happened. And this is a quote from Molesworth. "Whosoever takes the pains to visit Protestant countries that have lost their liberty will be convinced it is not popery as such, but the doctrine of blind obedience to any religion which leads to mental tyranny." One reason for the lapse of Denmark into tyranny, according to Molesworth, was the poor education system, the monopoly of clerical instructors, and so severe censorship that all speculation about religion and political questions are prevented. For Molesworth, the education of youth was a fundamental route to social progress. He declared, "The proper education of youth is the foundation of liberty. Education in the hands of priests, whether Lutheran, Anglican or Roman Catholic, inculcates doctrines of slavish obedience and do little to stimulate the search for truth and develop public spirit, courage, honour or enterprise. The curriculum, with its false emphasis on dead languages, was designed for the cloister rather than the real world." This may be read as a condemnation not alone of the Danish system, but of the English university system, which was at the time based on High Church Anglican control of Oxford and Cambridge by what Molesworth called university monks. Molesworth wanted an education to encourage active virtue and curiosity about the needs of one's country, and suggested that teachers should be philosophers rather than priests. Now, I think the word scientist wasn't in common use in Molesworth's time, and I think that's really what he meant. He didn't really mean a philosopher in the philosophizing sense. He meant those learned people who were not priests. He rejected Locke's argument that the provision of different knowledge should be based on social class. 90 years after Molesworth's death, William Drennan, the United Irishman, quoted him but did not name him in his opening address of the Belfast Academical Institute in 1814. Drennan told his listeners that the aim of the new academy would be that the mysterious veil that makes one knowledge for the learned and another for the vulgar will be torn down. Francis Hutchinson has been mentioned several times this morning. He's remembered today as the father of the Scottish Enlightenment. He's recognised as one of Ulster's and Ireland's great philosophers. Yet for most of his entire life, he was a scholar and a working teacher. His studies began in a small but renowned philosophy school in Killaloe, and thereafter continued at Glasgow. In 1719, along with William Drennan's father, he was invited by the Protestant dissenters of Dublin to open a dissenting academy at Drumcondra Lane, Dorset Street today. During his decade in Dublin, he produced 2 philosophical works which showed his considerable abilities as a liberal thinker. He was appointed to the chair of moral philosophy in Glasgow in 1730, and for the rest of his short life was taken up with his teaching duties there. Hutchinson believed that the role of the teacher was to inspire the listener with a sense of virtue and the possibility of a better life. He gained fame as a teacher in the university to teach philosophy he was the first teacher to teach philosophy in English rather than the customary Latin. His best known pupil, Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, said Hutchinson, was undoubtedly and beyond all comparison the most acute, the most distinct, the most philosophical of all my teachers. In his work, Hutchinson said that children had vigour and benign character and an implanted instinct towards knowledge. He therefore held that education should be open to all. In Philip Orr's insightful account of Archibald Hamilton Rowan, published by County Down Museum in 1998, I'm talking about Reclaiming Enlightenment on Philip Orr. He tells us that Rowan's generous donation to help William Godwin publish children's literature. He tells us of that, and he says, or goes on to tell us that it places Rowan and Hutchinson and the Scotch-Irish descent in culture in a key place in the evolution of the modern belief in widespread education. Or goes on to tell us that this approach to learning was to be conducted largely through encouragement of the imagination, creativity, rather than narrative instruction. Going back to William Drennan, when Lord Fitzwilliam was appointed Lord Lieutenant of Ireland in 1795, William Drennan addressed an open letter to him, outlining what he saw as the urgent reforms that were required if Ireland was to avoid revolutionary upheaval. In a wide-ranging, well-crafted thesis running to 46 pages, the first paragraph, the first and perhaps the most important reform Drennan called for was the introduction of a universal education system. This is a quote from Drennan. "The common people need to be educated As the people are daily becoming more sensible of their physical power, education is vital to stop them roaming into the savagery of nature. The most pernicious error that was ever poisoned the happiness of mankind has been the prejudice that there is one sort of knowledge for the learned and another for the vulgar. He went on to deplore the doctrine that vilifies the human race as the swinish multitude and a beggary of no value or estimation. He further deplored the doctrine that suggests that the multitude lacked the capacity to enjoy the rights of man. This letter was unlikely to make a good impression on Lord Fitzwilliam, one of William Pitt's administration. Pitt had banned Thomas Paine's rights of man and hounded Paine out of the country. The term the swinish multitude had been coined by Fitzwilliam's close friend and mentor Edmund Burke to describe the common people. Burke suggested the swinish multitude had no role in politics other than to do what they were told by their betters. Drennan's many open letters were never designed to convince the recipients. They were propaganda designed to boost the morale of the United Irishmen and their followers. Almost 2 decades after he wrote to Fitzwilliam, Drennan embarked on his most successful and enduring project. In 1814, he was the main mover in the establishment of the Belfast Academical Institute, the first university in Ireland after Trinity College, which had been established at the end of the 18th century. Drennan drafted a statement which held the Inst as likely to be a centre from which the lessons of science may emanate, not only illuminating the scholar and the speculative philosopher, but enlightening the husbandman, the manufacturer, the artisan, guiding their steps towards new discoveries and improvements in the path of human knowledge. It's important to realise that when Drennan talked about manufacturer, he was actually talking about the physical worker, the craftsman, not the way we think of a manufacturer today as a company. He was actually thinking of manual workers. Drennan was the principal speaker at the opening of the Inst. He told his audience that the college would be a place where ingenious men uniting in their labours without regard to nation, sect or party, where the youth entrusted to their care would be stimulated in the pursuit of knowledge and the practice of virtue. Drennan promised that fees would be as low as possible and that some students would be admitted free of charge. Most importantly, he said, the admission of scholars will be perfectly unbiased by religious distinction. Example rather than coercion will be the order of the day, as motives of the mind are better for education than pains inflicted on the body. The example should teach rather than manual correction or corporal punishment. Example should teach rather than manual correction or corporal punishment. Drennan made these comments 168 years before corporal punishment was abolished in the schools in the south of Ireland. Mary Wollstonecraft's writings reveal a keen concern for the education, especially for the education of women and girls. A vindication of the rights of women begins with a plea for equal education of women and includes an ambitious and far-sighted proposal for a national school system. Wollstonecraft had been a teacher. She had run a school with her sisters, Evina and Eliza, for the time in Newington Green. In 1785, Mary, returning from Portugal, where she had nursed her dying friend, Fanny Blood, following Fanny's death, the grief-stricken Mary hardly cared to discover when she discovered that in her absence the school had gone into terminal decline. When the school closed at the end of May, Mary was left with a very large debt and 2 dependent sisters. Her friend John Hewlett suggested that she write a book because he believed the world needed to hear her ideas on education. Mary penned her thoughts on education of daughters, reflections on female conduct in the more important duties of life. One chapter dealt with the situation of unmarried women like herself and her sister and her late Fanny. The chapter bore the title, The Unfortunate Situation of Females Fashionably Educated and Left Without Fortune. What Mary meant by fashionable education was advocated by some, such as the often progressive Miss Barraballs. She taught women too delicate to be independent of men, and that women were created for the pleasure and delight alone. Girl must be content to know a thing without understanding it. The renowned religious writer Hannah Moore believed that parents and teachers should drive the bold, independent, enterprising spirit out of girls, a philosophy based on the principle that women should be subordinate to men and learn to obey and not to lead. Of course, Mary Wollstonecraft found these ideas intolerable. She objected to the idea that women should be educated to be subordinate and agreeable wives. Such an education encouraged women to internalise their subjugation. Mary asked, "What is the ideal woman? Was she a fainting maiden, easily fatigued and naive? No, she was a resourceful and intelligent human being. Education should not consist of women learning by rote. Women should learn to think." This is another quote. Education was critically important to Wollstonecraft, both as a liberal reformer and a radical theorist and a proponent of women's rights. A broad spectrum of reformist writers and actors, from conservatives wishing to shore up the status quo to Jacobins wishing to overturn it, saw education as, if not the key locus for promoting social stability and engineering social revolution. Conclusion. Locke, Molesworth, Hutchinson, Drennan, Wollstonecraft recognised education as a vital aspect of social improvement and a pathway to human freedom. The idea of universal education, which was so much contested in their time and even regarded as revolutionary, appears to us today as to be mainstream and part of a well-accepted consensus. However, from the foundation of the national school system in the early 19th century, schooling on this island has been controlled by Roman Catholic and Protestant churches. Church control continued after the foundation of the Irish state. I cannot speak with authority about the system in Northern Ireland, but common sense tells me that segregated education does nothing to heal divisions in a divided society. When it came to educating our own children, the choice between sending them to be educated along with adherents of one or other religion was not acceptable to us. My partner Sheila was a prime mover in establishing Dublin 7 Educate Together some 20 years ago. The school is now thriving with 25 teachers and 450 pupils. My friend, the artist Robert Balla, some of you may have heard of, recently wrote a memoir. And in that memoir, he talked about his time in the elite fee-paying school of Blackrock College. He says how the president of the college reminded the boys that they were not Christian brother boys destined to be the hewers of wood and the drawers of ore. Remember the swinish multitude, the vulgar? No, they were the future leaders of Irish society. Ballard tells us he looked around. He thought the president had gone completely feckin' bonkers. This is what he says. Completely feckin' bonkers, he says. As most of his classmates were Aegis and Messers, right? Ballard was wrong, of course. Most of the Aegis and Messers went on to gain entrance into Ireland's highest and professional and political elite. Yet even elite privilege does not protect children. At least 233 men, graduates of Robert Balla and Eamon de Valera, the former president and Taoiseach of Ireland, they both went to this elite school. Well, 223 men from that school have made allegations of abuse against 77 priest teachers, some of whom are serial abusers who were left unchecked with access to children in the 1960s, the 1970s and the 1980s. Now, 300 years ago, Robert Molesworth told us that teacher priests inculcate a slavish mindset. Sometimes their crimes are even worse than that.
Thanks very much, Fergus, for a brilliant, really stirring talk about the importance of discarding the slavish mindset. So it's coffee time now, and we start up again at 11:30 with our second session. But before you all stampede to the coffee and tea, I want you all to give a round of applause to three wonderful speakers: Fergus, John Gray and Alan Miller. What a great start. Thank you.